Hello and welcome to Property Roundup on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we chat to industry experts to get a view on trends emerging. And this show is brought to you in partnership with Property District, changing the narrative of the industry. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Chris White, Development Manager at Circle VHA. Chris, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Carol, for inviting me.
Most people listening today will be well familiar with Circle VHA, but for anyone who isn't, you might just share the work that you do and the scale of operations that you're at.
Sure, yeah. So Circle VHA are an approved housing body who have been operating within Ireland for over 20 years. We've got about just short of 3,000 homes in our ownership or management, and we work with a number of local authorities around delivering those schemes. Currently within my own role, I manage the development team, and we are currently delivering a pipeline of just under 3,000 homes over the next 3 to 4 years. And that's through a mixture of turnkey schemes or direct build construction projects within our own team.
Very good. So then you're looking at a doubling in size. Where around the country are these proposed developments?
Yeah, so we currently operate in what we say is the sort of East Coast. So we're from Louth all the way down through the Dublin region, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Clare is where we're primarily based and where those schemes are at the moment. And then we're kind of moving our way gradually from the east over to the west through the Midlands at the moment. So we'll look at any opportunities within those locations. And we've got a healthy pipeline of sizable projects across the sort of main cities and counties.
Very good. And is the long-term vision for a nationwide service?
If we can get the right projects in the right location and at the scale that we need. So obviously, delivering homes is the first part of it, but there's the long-term strategy around management, maintenance, and tenancy services as well. So in order to deliver that effectively, you need to have a certain number of units per county.
Very good. Chris, what's your own background? How did you're obviously coming from a construction background?
Yeah, so look, I suppose I'm from the north originally, and I did qualify in building surveying and came out in 2007 from college, just at the height of the boom, moved to Dublin, started working in project management, did a few years in project management, and then obviously, the economy collapsed and construction dwindled. So I stepped out of sort of the construction arena for quite a few years, and then came back into it in 2017, and then started working within the AHB sector. So previously to my role in Circle, I would have worked with another tier 3 AHB.
Very good. Actually, the approved housing body sector has changed a lot over that period from 2017. I mean, like we've seen such a ramping up of scale and delivery. So maybe talk to us a little bit about the rate of delivery back in 2017 versus today.
Yeah, sure. So one of the key things I've noticed over the last couple of years is the size of projects that local authorities and the department are willing to support. So when I sort of first came into the AHB sector back in 2017, a scheme of 40 homes was seen as being quite large. And there was a lot of consideration about approving anything above that by the local authorities, where now we're getting into schemes of like 150, 200 homes. And then we've also got, Crell has come online. So it's allowed us to do mixed tenure schemes, which, in my view, it provides, another option for people to rent within the market. Obviously, the private sector is there, and it's important that they are delivering homes as well, because you need those different streams. But kind of bring it back to those key differences. Back in 2017, there would have been a very primarily focus on turnkey. You had a lot of sites that were left over from the crash that needed to be finished out. And one of my first projects that I ever worked on in the HB sector was a ghost estate, and completing a ghost estate. And in the last few years, we've transitioned from those turnkeys which are still an important part of delivery, but you're now seeing AHBs do more construction projects and are being asked by government to deliver more construction projects as well, which, I think the tier threes have actively taken, that call to action and have moved into that sector more over the last few years.
I think that's a really interesting journey for the construction industry as well, because there's been such an outpouring, an outcry, particularly politically, looking for the state to ramp up home building. And I think the approved housing bodies ramping up home building is almost like a step in that direction, or it's almost fulfilling that criteria without putting the onus on the state that just doesn't genuinely have the capability or the expertise in this area in recent decades. So I definitely want to come back and have a conversation about that. Just, you touched on there, Carol. So, Contractor, you might just explain that to people, because that's game changing for Ireland. And I think sometimes it's not, people don't realise. So you might just talk us through some of the different fundings, some of the things that have really transformed housing delivery in recent years.
Yes, I mean, look, just to touch on CREL, which is cost rental. It was an initiative brought in by government in the last few years, and it was to deliver a type of tenure for individuals who aren't eligible for social housing, but maybe doesn't necessarily want to take on a mortgage or don't have the capacity to take on a mortgage right now. And those properties are made available to rent, but the rents are at a minimum of 25% of the open market rents. So it's a more cost-effective way of renting for some people. What it also allows as well is a type of tenure which is more long-term. So those properties will have to be made available for a minimum of 40 years under the CREL financing. So, there isn't that uncertainty of, will my lease be ended? Will my landlord want to sell? They're always going to be available for that type of tenure. And what it allows people to do is, with that sort of discount that they might have in their rents, it's an opportunity for them to save potentially for a mortgage if they choose to do so. And when they move on, that property then becomes available for someone else who is in that looking to do the same thing in terms of have a long-term tenure rental.
Very good. And I routinely hear I'm critical of some of the schemes, but there have been some fantastic schemes introduced under Housing for All. I think there have been some less effective schemes, but the reality is I worry in Ireland that we're not getting the balance that we need across all tenures. So I don't believe it's a case of pitting any one type of delivery against the other. I think we need all types of delivery for all tenures, for both public and private sector, for both sales and rental. We just need all solutions across the board. So we'd like to see kind of a greater balance there. But I know that's probably part of our conversation for a larger day. And Chris, I'm curious, what is the difference being a development manager in the approved housing body sector as opposed to in the private sector?
I suppose the key thing for me is probably processes and procedures. So obviously, as an AHB, you're an NGO, and a lot of your funding streams is coming from public sector funding. So there's key sort of criteria for a project to be delivered that has to be met internally as an organization, and then with the department and our funders as well. So it's very much more of a sort of stage gate controlled process, and you have to make sure you got your necessary approvals in place before you can move to the next milestone. Whereas my experience of working in the sort of the private residential sector, now granted it was pre-2009, so people, once they got planning, the bank were obviously assisting them with funding, so they were going straight to construction and market as quickly as they can. So I think that's the two key things. I find within the AHB sector, it's a little bit slower getting through this sort of process. And a good example was there's a scheme that recently completed for another AHB that I used to work for, and I would have tendered for the design team in 2018, and it only finished this year. So it's taken 5 years to go from tender to completion of I think it's about 20-unit scheme.
Wow. Okay. So that is a long time. But on the other side of it, is there a greater predictability that actually you will be able to proceed? Because what we're seeing in the private sector at the moment is that up until last year, all the focus was on trying to get the right staff and trying to keep your materials flow, but not very few people, very few organizations in the private sector were worried about their pipeline. Their pipeline was full, whereas actually this year we realized that the pipeline may have been full, but it was more vulnerable than people thought. So with the approved housing bodies, is there a certainty around the pipeline that you have?
Yeah, I mean, look, if an AHB is going to tender on a project, it's a certain, I mean, they've achieved planning, the criteria for funding works, so they know that the project is going to be delivered at that point. It's a significant milestone when you're getting to that stage. So, in terms of the construction sector, I would say to them, like the AHB sector, or if they're asking for pricing at that point, then it's a guarantee that that project is going to start within 6 months of the tender being complete effectively.
Very good. And I enjoy your social media posts. I think it's great that we're talking so much more about the process and the procedures and the day-to-day delivery. I love that construction companies are sharing project updates. I love that I get to look around their building sites, see updates on things that just wouldn't have been shared 10 years ago, so it's good. We're kind of demystifying the process. We're helping people take a look. We're bringing them along on the journey. And I think that's so important. And I think in a way, that's why there's maybe a disconnect between people outside the industry who aren't seeing that day-to-day progress towards delivering homes. They think nothing's happening when they hear a government announcement or something, whereas actually within the industry, we can see it. We've been shown the progress all the time. And that's something that didn't happen really until the last number of years. But one of the things you talk about is delivering good social housing at scale. And I think that's really interesting because I'm not clear on what is good social housing. So, when you talk about delivering good social housing at scale, what do you mean? What makes social housing good?
What makes social housing good? Good question. So I suppose from a personal perspective, and I might just go back to where I originally grew up. I grew up in a place called Craigavon in Northern Ireland, which was a new town that was built in the 1960s and 70s. And they built social housing at scale, but it was the wrong type of social housing in the wrong location, and the quality was poor. So my view, if a social housing scheme is to be successful, what I deem, good quality social housing is it in the right location? Is it supported by amenities within the community? Is it close to shops, pharmacies, schools, those sort of sports halls, the amenities that someone might need within a community? Is near places of employment as well, and public transport. Within the development then itself, the quality of the build, has to be taken into consideration as well. And for me, it's like, are the units the right size? Are they laid out well? Are they taking advantage of the location that they're in? Is the build quality good? Have they a really strong energy rating? Are they low cost to maintain and operate? Particularly, over the last year, we've seen price rising in electricity prices and gas prices. Is it affordable for our tenants to actually operate the unit as well? From an AHB perspective, one of the key things for us is the scheme going to be cost effective to operate? So selecting the right materials at construction means that our operational costs down the line are more efficient. And that could be things from, instead of picking, say, painted render, that we go for brickwork instead, because that isn't going to have to be repainted every 5 to 10 years. Things like the type of lifts that we put in our apartment complexes. Are we going to pick a lift that's going to be more low maintenance and more robust? Even things like roofing, what materials do we select for roofs? Are they going to have to be replaced at 20 years or 30 years? And making those decisions at construction phase has an impact over the time frame that we operate and maintain that development. So those are the kind of what I would consider the key things as good quality homes. But, you know, it has to be right for the tenants as well. And one of the key things that Circle are starting to look at more recently is getting feedback from our existing tenants as to what makes a good quality social home, what's their experience around living in our existing schemes, and how can we take that information and feed it into our new projects.
The feedback mechanism is interesting because we don't do that enough. In the past, certainly in the private sector, tenants were seen as something transitory. So therefore, there wasn't the same focus. But I'd like to hear more about the feedback, so we might come on to that. But first, you're touching on so many areas there, from construction materials, obviously sustainability, which is a huge focus, right into placemaking, and they're all very different things. You wouldn't think, that in a way they might actually be not necessarily competing, but possibly conflicting. So, for example, in terms of construction materials, obviously, irrespective of the sector in which you're building, anybody building over the past 2 years has been subject to the same forces, the same pressures, and that has definitely had an impact on the supply of materials and the cost of materials. But in terms of quality of build, is that not something that our regulations, is compliance not an assurance of quality at this stage?
It has. I mean, if you look at, what was built pre-2000, say 2009 versus today, the quality is definitely vastly improved over the last 10 to 15 years. And BCAR has had an impact in terms of the regulation side of it as well. I suppose from our perspective as an AHB, when we talk about that is, if we capture everything during the construction phase and, make sure the quality is right at that point in time, we won't run into problems down the line. Because, even in the most simplistic terms for us, we try to minimize the amount of, say, defects in the initial couple of months that a building is occupied. And we see a successful project if it has the minimum amount of defects. And, those are simple things like, maybe the heating maybe doesn't work correctly first time, or a door is stuck because it hasn't been fitted properly. Those are minor ones. But it's important that we get the quality right from the get-go.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you touched on size, and this is some bit of a contentious issue, size and layout and dual aspect. These have all been contentious issues over the last number of years. But in terms of size, are we overcorrecting? Because we know the household size, we know that the demand is for smaller units. And, is that something that you would, is that kind of I suppose something you would buy into, or do you think we still need to be delivering larger sized units? I mean, for example, would Circle VHA have an interest in one bed and expanding the one bed stock, or do you think it has to be a minimum of 2 bed?
Oh no, we definitely, you can see it within the local authorities, and I think Dublin's demand for 1 and 2 beds is around 50% of their waiting list at the moment. So our what we deliver is generally driven by what's the waiting list with the local authorities. So if there's a higher demand for 1 and 2 beds, we certainly do them. But within, say, the size of a 1 bed, it doesn't necessarily have to be oversized, but it has to make really good use of the space that's being provided and making sure there's adequate storage. Because the stuff that comes with everyday living, having that additional space and be able to put it away can make a space so much more useful in terms of being a home.
Yeah, in terms of storage, I think that's something that, I've lived in other European cities, and apartment living there is completely different than what it is in Ireland, because
Yes.
Apartment living comes with basement storage, it comes with lots of facilities, it comes with built-in storage that Irish apartments just traditionally didn't. So in terms of design, how are you designing in space to small areas?
So it's a good question. So we have a new scheme that's currently on site at the moment, which is Railway Court in Dublin 1, and it's a 47 apartment complex, mixture of 1, 2s and 3 beds. And we were taking a look at our 1 bed units the other day that are on the ground floor. They're level access, their own door, so they come straight off the street. And what we've done is, in order to make more efficient use of space, we do have an oversized cupboard in the hallway, which you can hide everything that you need to hide. But beyond that, to make it more accessible for that type of property, because it's a one bed, we've created access from the bathroom into the bedroom. So if there is a person who has mobility needs or might need a hoist in the future, we're not having to tear down a wall in order to make that happen. We've built in future redundancy already within that unit.
Oh, that's a really interesting one. What's the timeline on Railway Court?
It's due for completion in April 24.
Lovely. Actually, it would be great if you're offering tours of that location before you open. Actually, it'd be great to get a look around there, because actually, again, we need to think about how we're configuring smaller spaces. It's not about larger spaces. We just need to get much smarter in terms of some of the smaller spaces, because we know that that's where the demand is. So, look, if you're open to it, we'd love to take a tour around that as you get closer to completion. Just again, an oversized hallway. I think every home needs an oversized hallway, irrespective of the number of bedrooms that you're in. But in terms of some of the other areas you touched on around amenities and placemaking, one of the things that we know was done wrong in past decades was, not having this proper integration of public and private housing within the same community. And I think so much work has been done to address that over the past decade and a half that, that should never be a problem now. However, we are seeing an increase in the level of community objections to any form of new development coming into their homes. So how are you navigating that, to make sure that you're bringing in those community spaces and amenities, but that you're able to integrate well with the existing communities?
Yeah, I mean, look, what we've done with our own direct build projects is that we've actively engaged with the community. And we're going through it recently on a new scheme where we're pre-planning at the moment for 35 older person apartments within the Dublin region. And we've had our first consultation with the local residents, local community, to say, this is our concept. What do you guys think? We're taking that feedback away, and then we're going to have a second consultation to say, we've listened, and here's the changes that we can make if we're able to, within sort of the rules of planning and the density and any other bits and bobs that might have an impact on a grant of planning. I think it's a good way to understand what the community concerns and fears are around a social housing scheme coming into place. Because one of the things I find doing this job over the last couple of years, and I've done a number of community engagement events, is there is always concerns about social housing coming into an area and into a new location. But once the scheme is built, tenanted, and in operation, very rarely are any of those fears realized. It beds in and just becomes part of the community. So my belief is engage, listen, understand what their concerns are. If it's anything from a design perspective, then you try and mitigate that. Where if it's an issue because of social housing, then we try to educate around how we tenant, how we manage our properties, how we're responsible for maybe the maintenance and landscaping, and there's a point of contact within our organization. There are any issues that you can come to us in the future.
Chris, I love how you've articulated that. Do you know the old adage of, to a person with a hammer, everything's a nail? Well, I am definitely someone with a hammer when it comes to community engagement. I truly believe, because I've seen it in practice over the last 2 decades, that despite the fears of project owners, community engagement can only improve a project. And that actually a lot of cases, it is around fear, irrespective of the reason being given. There's an underlying fear at the, that is really at the heart of a lot of resistance. And education, like engagement, is absolutely number one. Listening, huge, but education has to be a huge part of it, and that has to be two-way. No community wants to be talked to; they want to be spoken with, and that listening. So actually, you've articulated that really well, and it's something that I hope project owners will take away from the call today, because that fear doesn't just exist among the community. The industry has a fear of engagement as well. And I can genuinely say, after 2 decades, that I have never seen community engagement make a project worse. It has only ever made a project better. But it requires a really honest approach and an open-mindedness on both parts, and it can take a bit of work to get those minds open. And that's that's an important first step, but I'm really glad you brought it up today. Speaking of the industry, and I'm conscious of your time, I don't want to delay you much longer, but we started this interview by talking about the scaling up of delivery by the approved housing body sectors and Circle as part of that. Talk to me about those relationships between the approved housing bodies and contractors, because right now that's key to delivery.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're in as our CEO says, we're in the midst of a housing emergency, and we need to ramp up and scale up our delivery as quickly as possible. One of the key sort of things, I believe that there's a really strong and good relationship between contractors, developers, and AHBs across Ireland right now. We're all working together for the common goal to deliver additional homes across the country. So I think it's important. I also think as well, if you look at, say, maybe the top 10 home builders in Ireland, I think as AHBs, we might need to look at how they're delivering at scale and how do we replicate that within the AHB sector. I think that's something that we should start looking at if AHBs are expected to deliver more construction projects over the next few years.
I think that's a really interesting one. And, you refer to John Hannigan's call there for a housing emergency. He's not the only person in the industry, both public and private sector, to call our housing crisis a housing emergency. And I think sometimes that gets slightly watered down, but actually there's a huge difference politically and if the state were to recognise Ireland's housing crisis as a housing emergency, that could actually be really game changing, not in the way that politicians talk about it being game changing, but it could actually change delivery by bringing in some interim measures in terms of planning, infrastructure delivery, some of the support needed around it. So actually, just because you've touched on it there, I'm going to take the opportunity. We talk about it routinely most weeks on the show here. We have somebody calling for Ireland's housing crisis to be declared an emergency, and we absolutely second that. So I think it's really important every day we talk about the difference between a housing crisis and a housing emergency. Right now, our housing crisis is recognised as that, but actually we may need it to be recognised as a housing emergency if we really want to, if we wanted to jumpstart on our housing for all targets. We know there's great work being done, but there are still blockages in terms of planning, in terms of infrastructure delivery, that at some point may even need to be bypassed for a period of 24 months just to get stuff done.
I would agree, and my view is more working on the grind. So I can see roadblocks of what it takes to get a project from looking at a site to completion. And the key things for us is the planning, utility connections. If we're working with a developer, getting the Part 5 agreed so we can progress to contract and get the developer going. So, where those roadblocks, I think you're right, temporarily for 24 months that we take a view of how do we mitigate, or how do we step those aside and just to ramp up building over the next few years. And definitely, planning is an issue. If I look at, Circle's pipeline and where we're talking to developers who are going in for planning, we've had a number of projects that have gone to the board, or they've been taken to the high courts because it was an SHD, and that has delayed our pipeline and what we've been able to deliver. And one of our schemes, which is literally 5 minutes from my house, is still in the High Court over an appeal that was taken on the second application. So it's had 2 grants, but been taken to the High Court both times. And that's 150 homes that have been stalled. And other HBs are experiencing it as well. I think if you actively ask the HB sector, like if they were to look at their pipeline, how many got stuck in the planning process, and like the extra time it took to get it through, how quickly could we have delivered if that hadn't happened?
Yeah, and look, Paul Mitchell of Mitchell McDermott has shared some research in terms of the number of units stuck in judicial review. It's something we've discussed many times here in the show. We know this is a problem. Unfortunately, it is one of so many problems that the priority in addressing it maybe is not there. But I think you're absolutely right. Some of the common challenges, irrespective of the sector in which you're delivering, comes down to planning and utility connections. So that's something that the upgrading of Ireland's housing crisis to an emergency might actively address. So listen, Chris, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and expertise today. And certainly we would love to take a visit to Railway Court as you're nearing completion. I think that'd be a really interesting exercise to see. But for now, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. That was Chris White, Development Manager at Circle VHA. And my thanks to Katie Tallon and the production team at Hear Me Roar Media today. And indeed, thanks to our show sponsor, Property District, changing the narrative of the industry. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out all of the other real estate and construction shows on iPropertyRadio. And thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Property Roundup on iPropertyRadio.